Gilman Louie, welcome to the State Secrets Podcast. It's always great to have you here at the Cipher Brief.
It's always great to be here.
I hope you have a cup of coffee because you're going to need something to do while I read off your list of accomplishments over the course of your career. It's crazy. You have more than 30 years of national security experience, investment experience. You were an early CEO of In-Q-Tel, which I think everyone listening knows was that pioneering technology investment firm that was funded by the CIA, and you led that from 1999 to 2006. You've served on the Defense Innovation Board. You've served as a commissioner on the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. You're running your own fund now. You're a co-founder and managing partner at America's Frontier Fund. Are you done with your coffee yet? Should I keep It's crazy. It's just crazy, all the things that you have touched over the course of your career. Just talk to me a little bit about like who you are, why your fascination with national security and with particularly with investing and the private sector world. Tell me about you.
Well, I grew up in a blue collar family. My dad was Army Air Corps in World War II, served with the Navy throughout his civilian life. My brother went off to serve in Vietnam in the Navy. And when I had my call from the director of CIA, he asked me, "What have you done for your country lately?" And it was, this is pre 9/11. And I think the concern expressed at that time was the fear that there was going to be another Pearl Harbor around the corner. And the conditions that led us up to Pearl Harbor, the inability to put the pieces together, to understand what was happening, even though we were gathering all the intelligence from around the world, even back in 1941, we were not organized in a way to get that information across to decision makers to take action. And I think there was a sense in late 1999 that we were going to find ourselves in a very similar position. And, it was prescient that they were worried about this set of problems as you were running up to 9/11. And the need was clearly articulated by the Director of Central Intelligence at that time, George Tenet, who convinced me that in spite of the fact that I had the world's greatest job, which was the Chief Creative Officer at Hasbro Interactive, that's a little bit like Tom Hanks in the movie Big, that the national calling was more important. So went back to my roots, back to my family roots to serve the country, and I took the job.
Yeah. And the job was?
To lead up a new way of interfacing with the technology community that the agency did not have good tools to use. The agency has built its technical foundation off of great American companies, the defense contracting community, the tried and true, technology companies of the day like IBM and Honeywell, and Motorola, and didn't know quite how to interface with this kind of growing technology transition that was taking place in the Valley. Mm-hmm. And they had a lot of different ideas, but one of the ideas that I laid out was, do what the Valley companies do, right? Start a strategic venture capital fund, no different than Intel, Oracle, or any of the big technical companies of the day, and start engaging with the technology centers of excellence, not just in Silicon Valley, even places like Boston and Austin, Seattle, and throughout the country, and create your own vehicle to do it. And Director of Central Intelligence, together with the expert, Buzzy Krongard, said, "Great idea, why don't you go do it?"
Careful what you offer.
Exactly right.
That's really grown into something that, In-Q-Tel has really been incredibly successful. Some might say too successful for a government organization, but you learned a lot of lessons from that. I think it's interesting that at the time that the CIA was thinking about how to better organize in a way to share information, we are once again facing a big challenge if we shift over to look at the Pentagon and the Department of Defense, for example, where you've sat on a number of boards to help them think about innovation and growth. Gilman, it's interesting that what I keep hearing from folks is that we're still not organized in a way that we're sharing information, but more importantly, perhaps that we're not implementing what we know in more effective ways. Let me just say, do you think that's true, or how are you looking at the ability of the Department of Defense today to remain as competitive as it needs to be?
Look, I think if you look over the history of modern warfare, particularly in the United States, there have been specific eras that were transitioned how we thought about modern warfare. I mean, it was, the tank in World War One. The battleships transitioned to aircraft carriers in World War II in aviation, right? We then moved into modern technology warfare with offsets, and things like stealth and precision guided weapons. And as we are learning right now, particularly in places like the Ukraine, right, the concepts of warfare, particularly long warfare, not short bursts, requires us to rethink about how we fight, how we deter, and how we man and team up our military to be able to confront any of the challenges that are facing it. And I think, we might find ourselves in a very difficult position today as probably a technology leader in the world, where everybody looks at the U.S. military and says, amazing technology. You think about the B-21, the F-35, the Aegis ships, and the next generation of underwater warfare submarines like the Seawolf. All those are unbelievable platforms. But as we're learning in the Ukraine, small, simple systems in the thousands can overcome very sophisticated systems that are afield. And one of the worries some of us on the defense side worry about is, are we becoming like Germany of World War II, which we had the most sophisticated weapons, but lacked the factors of production to be able to meet the need and demand of the warfare of the day. So while the Germans had, Messerschmitts and jets and Tiger tanks, Americans won the war by our ability to produce B-17s and Sherman tanks, all which may be inferior to whatever it is of the thing of the day, but we could outproduce them. They were more reliable, and they delivered impact when they needed to deliver impact in mass and in quantity.
Mm-hmm. Gilman, you talk about the factors of production. I mean, what we've seen in Ukraine, as you've described too, are drone swarms being used very effectively. We've seen counter drones that have been launched. I mean, it's just almost unbelievable, the technological development that we've seen on the front there. What are the lessons back here in terms of, you mentioned factors of production? What does that look like inside the United States?
Well, clearly the Ukrainians have done a great job of using dual use technologies. A lot of consumer tech being redeployed in a way with a lot of imagination and taking advantage of the indigenous capabilities of what they have. So if you take a look at their drones, they're being built by furniture manufacturers, right? Turns out wood is pretty stealthy on top of that, right? That ability to innovate and take advantage of what your country has to offer, right, really shows how agility wins fights. And in the U.S., again, if we kind of look at our challenges on our supply chains and how long it takes us to build the system, it takes decades now to get to initial operating conditions for our most sophisticated weapons, the F-22, the F-35, even producing older style aircraft like the F-15EX or the F-16 Block 70s, right? We cannot manufacture them to meet the demands that's in front of us. And it's a real shame that, you look at U.S. manufacturing now, if you think of it as just as a percentage of GDP, 3 decades ago was, 70% of GDP, 70% of the manufactured goods were manufactured here in the U.S. Today's barely 10%. And, and so our inability to build ships, our inability to build simple things like munitions, artillery shells, Stinger missiles, much less our ability to go off and build next generation stealthy aircraft at scale and at speed, is not going to keep up with a fight that might go long. Mm-hmm. And again, U.S. military is very good in short-term warfare. But as we learning as the wars drag on and conflict drags on, like what we're seeing in Ukraine and even over in places like Gaza, right? Is the U.S. really prepared to do that? And are we really leveraging the best science and technology that's in front of us, right? Are we taking advantage of the capacity and imagination of the technology and scientific sectors to help us fight or prepare to fight or even prevent a fight downstream?
Mm-hmm. So talk to me a little bit about the purpose of, I mean, you definitely have a Pentagon that has different boards that offer advice on innovation. They've got the Defense Innovation Unit based in Silicon Valley that's been trying to really bring in a lot of times off the shelf technologies that can be used in DoD. I mean, you've been a part of you've seen all of these efforts at least develop over the years. Are they just not quite where they need to be? And if so, where do we need to be competitive for this world we're facing, where China and AI and all these other things that you focused on quite a bit are having such a tremendous impact on our future?
You know, the Department of Defense is about ready to spend $1 trillion to equip and provide the personnel with the capabilities to support the military going forward. But as innovative as those programs are, and there are a lot of innovative programs inside the Department of Defense, you know, everywhere from DARPA to DIU, you know, there's many office with the word transformation right in front of it. The reality is, as a percentage of that budget, we're not seeing the dollars being put aside with the intent. If we were a corporation, the Department of Defense was a corporation, we will be spending 10 to 20% of our budget on innovation if we were truly committed to it. And if you look at the dollars spent, you know, even if we moved the budget of DIU to $1 billion, then you put $1 billion of Office of Strategic Capital into that. Okay, that's 2%. That does not move the needle. That's 2% of 100 billion. It's actually 0.2% of $1 trillion. So it's not at the level or scale that meets the needs of what we're going to need to going forward, which means as a department, we probably have to pivot. And that doesn't mean that we would give up the high-end systems, because that is a U.S. advantage, and I would hate the U.S. to give up that advantage, right? But all that stuff in the middle needs to be basically redeployed and rethought of how do we extend our ability to innovate in quantity and at scale with the speed and agility that will prepare us or prevent somebody from attacking interests of the United States. And everybody knows what the timetable is. There's no, you know, everybody talks about 2027 and 2028, right? But the lack of urgency in many areas of the department is not meeting the need of the day. And that's not to say there aren't parts of the department that isn't worked up right now and very concerned about it, because there are good men and women throughout the department trying to do their best to build that system. But the bureaucracy, how we purchase, you know, the FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulations, the DFARs, how we build our industrial base is not tuned to be able to produce the kinds of systems we need of the future. And quite frankly, hasn't really engaged industry outside of a few notable exceptions like Palantir and Anduril, and there are a few others, far too few to meet the needs of what the department is going to have in the next, for the remaining part of this decade.
Yeah. Talk to me about America's Frontier Fund, where you're the co-founder, you're also the managing partner. You know, Gilman, over the years, there have been a number of individuals like you who have a deep passion for national security, who have a great deal of knowledge when it comes to investing and innovating. And they've had some mixed success. Some have done pretty well in sort of engaging with Pentagon and getting some new things started, and some have gotten really frustrated. Talk to me about what you're trying to do with the fund and creating something external to the government that is focused on investing in national security.
Well, the good news is we're already partnering with the government through the Office of Strategic Capital for the Department of Defense and through the Small Business Administration, which is one of our lead funders in America's Frontier Fund, with the goal of working with the department to imagine what we need to unlock the resources that are available throughout the United States, pair it with capital coming in from the capital markets. Right? You know, it's like $45 trillion that goes into our capital markets. Right? It's the biggest resource that the United States has access to leverage that to build out this new future and to do it at the speed of the valley. Right? There is a mismatch right now between how the department moves at what they consider a speed and how Silicon Valley moves at speed. Right? It needs that interface to make sure we don't grind our gears and we actually produce the kinds of things that we need to do. And so I can't take credit for that because that work came from the department. You know, the good news about the Department of Defense is that there are thought leaders in places like DIU, in places like OSC. And so by putting those pieces together, what we hope to do is serve as a catalyst of change, right? To go out and be a tool in which we can encourage the rest of the economic and technology capabilities, not just on the coast, but everywhere there's innovation throughout the United States, to apply it against the set of problems and challenges we now face.
So you're looking to try to really partner with the government. We've heard this term public-private partnership for so many years, and I think it's meant different things over the years. But as you're looking now in a future where technology plays such a critical role in any future war, how is that changing? I mean, how do you see that landscape?
Well, in the old days, partnership was really kind of government-led, private sector supported. Mm-hmm. I think if you talk to people like Steve Blank, right, who teaches at Stanford and has been working throughout a number of efforts to help transform the department. It was his view and many other people's view that we actually need to be industry-led and government-supported. And that change is a massive change, right? Nobody writes the strategic plan for Silicon Valley. It doesn't work that way. American innovation does not work that way. We don't operate on 5 and 10 year plans. That's the old Soviet model. That's how the Chinese do it, right? Mm-hmm. We out innovate the rest of the world because we tap into the power of the individuals, the entrepreneurs, the scientists, the academics, the businesses, right? To imagine what is possible, right? To do what everybody says can't be done. That's the power of American innovation. And that is not something you script out in terms of requirements, right? And long RFIs and RFPs. Mm-hmm. I mean, you think about back in the old days, the Skunk Works, the F-104, the U-2, Corona, SR-71. Those were led by industry who said, we can do something that the DoD can only dream of, right? And they delivered it. I mean, think about the U-2, right? That program was done for under $20 million, ahead of schedule. Lockheed even gave money back to the Department of Defense. The F-104 with specifications were written out on a single piece of paper and delivered 1 year and 1 day after that paper was written and put in front of the Secretary of Defense. And the SR-71 was done with 70 plus engineers to design that aircraft. So, we kind of need to get back to it. We know it can be done. We know how to do it. We have the talent to get it done. There's some gaps that we need to fill, like manufacturing and production. Mm-hmm. But, think about the gigafactories, right? Think about what Elon has done on things like SpaceX and Tesla, right? It isn't that we can't do it. We just have to choose to do it.
So how is the private sector going to be able to lead in this area? I mean, it's really, as you said, I mean, we're not where we were back in the day when those other technologies were developed. And now we're facing procurement, I can't even say it, procurement difficulties that sometimes it can take years to work through the system. There's so much red tape. Is that, do you think, the Achilles heel of the Pentagon right now? Is it sort of procurement and red tape?
Yeah, I think if you think about how regulations get developed, each regulation was created to prevent something bad that had happened in the past. Mm-hmm. So you make a rule so you don't do that again, right? And then over the years, you end up with 1,600 pages of these rules to prevent what happens in the past. Mm-hmm. And what happens in that mindset is fear of failure rather than desire to succeed. And we need to return back to the pioneering spirit that built the department, to do it with foresight, not hindsight. Mm-hmm. And that means now for us to go through that pivot, to re-examine how we buy things, how we build things, how we partner with industry, right? To let loose the power of American industry to really keep us ahead. And if we don't do it, there's a lot of discussion right now in the Beltway about the potential change that's going to come in with this new administration, right? Yep. But one thing we do know, whether you agree with the approach of the change or not, is that the current trajectory that we're on is not a winning trajectory. We have to change that rate of speed and the rate of change for us to make sure our adversaries don't catch us. We're still ahead. I want to make that real clear. The U.S. is still ahead, but the window is shrinking very, very rapidly.
When you say still ahead, you're talking about China and you're talking about the development of technologies that can be used in warfare and cyber. You're talking about artificial intelligence. You're talking about quantum. Those are the things you're talking about when you say we're still ahead?
Yes. So in those areas, we're still ahead. And to build our ability to build the exquisite, nobody can match that in the United States. Our ability to build at quantity and at scale, we're behind, right? And so as you're learning what's happening in the Ukraine right now, right? If that is the template of warfare going forward, right? Then the U.S. is in the precarious position right now that if we don't go back to our roots really is about our superiority in manufacturing, about our ability to out logistics our competitors. And we've fallen in love with the kind of the shiny objects and we outsourced everything else. Mm. And so when we rethink about where the military needs to go in the Defense Department, we have to go back to basics, right? Remove the barriers that prevent us from building things, right? Train up the workforce to have the trade skills necessary to construct. Use automation and AI, not just for the military systems themselves, but on how we actually build things. And if we can do that, we can get there. We're also going to have to change the way we buy things, right? Instead of, this idea that we're going to specify, put out RFIs and RFPs, compete, buy low cost, right? Do contracts on a year by year basis. We need to say, look, here's my problem. You tell us the best way to solve this problem, you industry. Mm-hmm. And if you solve our problems, well, we'll guarantee the buy, mm-hmm. right? without that long-term guarantee, you're not going to get the financial community investing in these areas, right? Nobody's going to invest billions of dollars in R&D to build out a system simply to have it recompeted to the lowest bid after you invent it. That is not an economic model that makes any sense at all.
Let me ask you a very blunt question. It has always been sort of understood that government and the private sector have different agendas. I mean, the private sector needs to usually make shareholders happy. They need to make money. They need to be able to sell into markets that sometimes the United States might see as adversaries. So how do you see that changing from before into this territory that we're moving into now, where China has put out its several documents on where it intends to be 10, 15, 20 years from now? How do you see that relationship between the public and private sector changing? And how do you motivate companies to do it other than a sense of national security and supporting national security?
Well, you go back to World War II, right? You think about how from December 7th to about December 7th, 1941 to about May of 1942, how industry swung into action. Right? Yeah. We didn't create new factories of the future back then. We took the factories we already had, the Ford lines, the Chrysler lines, the GM lines. Instead of pumping out cars, we were making tanks. We took aircraft manufacturers that are doing commercial aviation and transformed them into the ability to be unrivaled in our ability to produce aircraft. We were building a ship a day off of our shipyards. Now, today's a little bit different because we lost that industrial base. But American technology companies have been thinking about how do you manufacture at scale using automation, using robotics, using AI, right? We can build those factories here. We don't have to build them in places like Taiwan or rely on the Chinese to do it, right? Again, it requires us to have the will. I would love to have Undersecretary of Manufacturing be an official position of the United States Department of Defense.
Yet another new role.
Right. We can get rid of all the other ones, but put one person in charge whose job it is to make sure our industrial base can deliver the goods at the quantity and scale we need. Right. Yeah. And so we get to reimagine all this. Yeah. So, look, it's really scary to let go of the past. It's sort of like I equate it to the Navy letting go of its battleships and replacing them with these little fragile things called airplanes as a principal form of warfare. We're going to need to do the same thing here. We going to have to let go of some of the things that we are so committed to of the past. Organizationally, how we equip, how we train, all of the things that we think, right, that we can't let go of because it's who we are, we have to in order to prepare for the future. And it's not just in the department. It's also true on the intelligence side. This sequential way we do intelligence, from, tasking to collections to dissemination. That's a very old model. Nobody in the modern world gets their information that way. So why do we provide information to our warfighters and to our leaders of our country in that very old 1950 style processing? So
what do you propose? What do you propose as a better way?
Well, I think we need to rethink our, let's go on intelligence first. I think we really need to rethink about how we organize our intelligence services from that of things that collects things. There's a couple agencies that do things in space, and there's another agency who does things for humans, and there's another agency who does it with, law enforcement, and we got like 18 of these things, right? And every one of them are like organized around certain problems. So we got like 18 different shots on goal to deal with China, right? Maybe we should have China as an organizing principle. Maybe we should organize around threats rather than things, because things don't kill us, threats do. And in the Department of Defense, granted, we have our services, their job is to supply our ability and prepare ourselves from the fight, and we have code comms that go off, right, and execute the fight. right? But maybe we need to rethink that too. This idea that, okay, Army, you can only do things that don't have fixed wings and things with rotors. And the Marines, you can only use the stuff that none of the other guys wanted. And the Navy, you can only do things that have ships. Again, if you organize around the objective rather than the things, you're far more likely to achieve your goal. Mm-hmm. Post 9/11, we created, right, the counter-terrorist centers and the different sharing units throughout the United States with law enforcement because we were fighting terrorism, right? We weren't organized around things. Does that require a huge rethink? Yes. Is it going to take us time to do it? Yes. But if we don't start today, we can't wait until after the next crisis for us to go do another commission and study and then run around with our heads chopped off trying to fix it right on the fly.
What about that sense of urgency that you talked about, though? Because you mentioned, between December 1941 and May 1942, when all of these factories sort of very quickly pivoted into manufacturing to support the war. I mean, you had something that happened that brought people together. There was a sense of unity and a sense of understanding what you were fighting to protect. I feel like, and I don't know if you feel the same way, Gilman, but the lines have been blurred today. It's difficult for people to see the threat from China, for example, in the same way that they saw the smoke coming up from the ships in Pearl Harbor. It's very difficult, I think, for the average American to see the threat today. Do you feel like it's equally as urgent today as it was on December 8th?
I think it is. If you kind of look up where we are today and you go back to 1940 and the early months of 1941, right? They were worried about the German threat. They were worried about the Japanese threat, right? They were worried about the axis of evil, right? And now you kind of look out and you see Iran and you see North Korea and you see China and you see the Russians and you see the underlying nations all reorganizing around, right, different structures that are going to be competitive with the U.S. Now, that doesn't mean that everything always has to end in a fight, in a kinetic fight, right? I mean, today's kind of warfare includes things like economic warfare, right? Information warfare, cyber warfare, right? We're thinking about space. I mean, it's on many more dimensions than we had back in the 1940s. Nevertheless, everybody sees it, but we all like to admire the problem. And this is where it comes down to it, to the new Trump administration coming in. This is where leadership matters, right? Will we have the leaders who will be bold enough to make the changes necessary to prepare us for the next several decades ahead? And can we move with the speed and urgency to prevent the temptations of another nation state from imposing their will on the U.S. as we enter the back half of this decade? And I think there's enough good people in the defense industry and in technology and in intelligence to do it, but it does require leadership. It does require the permission to change. We're going to have to break some things in order to build the next new thing. But if we don't do it, it's going to get thrust upon us. And there may not be time this time around for us to have those months between December 7th and May of 42 to actually take the corrective steps.
Let me ask you the very tricky question, too, just to make sure that you don't get too comfortable during our conversation here. But, politics is an issue always in Washington. And you have a new administration coming in that has demonstrated the first time around they're not afraid to break things. Sometimes you can break things and build them back even better. Sometimes you break things and they remain broken. So how confident are you that the politics isn't going to get in the way and that the true experts are going to be able to come together to sort of break what needs breaking and then build it in a non-political, expert-based American way? Is that even in the cards, do you think?
I actually believe it's in the cards. I mean, look, when you close the door and you're trying to solve a really knotty problem within the Department of Defense, right? Or within the intelligence community. We don't check what party cards people carry, right? I mean, it's pretty interesting and somewhat entertaining to read the stuff that's in the news, right? But when you have somebody's life depending upon what you build, if your ability to execute your capability is going to protect the citizens of the United States, or men and women who are going to all go off in battle, or our allies and a partner, that's a different kind of serious stuff. And while people may disagree on the political views of kind of where things are going, national security and economic security is not a partisan topic. And I think there's this opportunity. Look, it doesn't matter if you ask a Democrat or a Republican who understands our defense systems and our intelligence systems, that there will be a disagreement between them on the need for change and the need to speed things up and to change the bureaucracy and lean into the innovation that's necessary for the department, right? Again, it just requires leadership. And it does require us to let go of certain things. Look, we're going to spend $1 trillion a year in defense. You know, we're starting companies to go after markets that are a lot smaller than $1 trillion. So it isn't that industry can't be productive, can't be successful, that companies can't be the next generation of leaders that will lead us with new capabilities. But we have to make that call today. We can't kick the can down the road.
We need to lead with opportunity. I like that very much. Gilman Louie, thank you so much for taking some time. I know you're jetting all over the country, the world. I don't know, you're busy all the time, but we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today on the State Secrets Podcast. It's great to see you.
Thank you.